fishermen, making them disciples. Amen. 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 Everybody sing. Amen. Everybody sing. Amen. Why don't we all sing? Amen. 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 Singing in the garden, praying to his Father, with deepest sorrow. Amen. Amen. They marched him up to Pilate. Then they crucified him. But he rose one morning. Amen. 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 Let the sister sing.
Amen. 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 Amen.
Now the brothers sing.
Amen. Amen. Mercy.
Amen.
Amen. Amen.
Everybody sing.
Amen.
Come on.
Amen. Amen.
Hello everyone. I'm sure everyone watching knows about the Apollo 11 mission. It was the one that landed on the moon. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. I mean, that one's going to echo throughout the history books forever. The most amazing exploration, technological feat in the history of humanity. But my favorite mission was Apollo 8. Apollo 8, 4 months, before its launch date, decided to completely rework the mission. They said, instead of going up and going around the Earth and testing some things out, let's go to the moon. We're going to make it to the moon. We're going to go around the moon several times, and then we're going to come back. No one had ever done that before. The Soviets hadn't done it. America certainly hadn't done it. And they said, let's do that in 16 weeks. We got to figure out how that's going to work. But in 16 weeks, we're going to the moon. They weren't going to land there, but they were at least going to go around the dark side of the moon and then come back. It was bold. It was crazy. And as we know, they did it. And they did it in late December of 1968. Now, 1968, some of you may recall, was a dark year in the minds of many people here in America. Over 16,000 American soldiers died in Vietnam that year. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968, as was Robert Kennedy. Riots broke out across the country. I mean, many people in American society thought, are we becoming completely unhinged here? These astronauts were scheduled to have a TV broadcast on Christmas Eve, 1968. And what's crazy, these astronauts, so Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders, they were told by NASA that, hey, when you have your TV broadcast, you're going to have the largest audience listening to a single voice at one time ever in the history of humanity. And so the only instructions NASA gave them was just do something appropriate. I mean, can you imagine that? Today there would be PR firms brought in, there'd be multiple drafts, there'd be a script handed to the astronauts. You will say this and this alone if you have that many people listening and you're representing us. Back in 1968, they just told them, hey, listen, don't do anything stupid. Just do something appropriate. You're going to have a lot of people listening in. It's crazy. And so, the broadcast happens on Christmas Eve, 1968. They give some information about the flight and how things are going, and they turn the TV camera outside their window so they could see the moon, because they were orbiting around the moon at that point. And what they said as they closed out their broadcast reverberated around the world. They pointed their camera to the moon, like I said, and with over 1 billion people listening in over 64 countries, they started reading. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. Then they passed the mic to another astronaut, and he continued reading in Genesis 1. And then another astronaut continued reading in Genesis 1. It was reported that men in the flight control in Houston were just crying tears. They were just so moved. Jim Lovell, who was on the flight, said that he received many letters from people around the world about that flight, but the one that he remembers and the one that he kept is from this woman that said, "Thank you for saving 1968." Now, in that broadcast, as they read Genesis 1, people's view, their perspective was broadened. They were reminded of the one planet that we all share together. It got their view off their problems and the tragedies that had taken place, and it got it on something bigger. Last week we discussed the narrowness of Jesus. And today, though, we're going to discuss the breadth of Jesus. And just real quick, in the description of this video, we're going to put the link of the full kind of end of the broadcast from that Apollo 8 crew on Christmas Eve 1968. I encourage you to watch that afterwards. It's hard not to get goosebumps listening to it. We'll also have a link to the Charles Edward Jefferson book called The Character of Jesus, on which this very lesson and many more to come will be based off of. So I encourage you to go read the chapter on the breadth of Jesus. I want you to think about a time in your life when you were a part of something bigger than yourself. Perhaps it was a sports team that you were on. Maybe you were part of a theater group or a band, or I don't know. Maybe it was a project you were working on at your job, and this project would affect many different people. But think of what it felt like to be a part of something bigger than yourself, where your perspective expanded on what was happening in the world. Like I said, last week we looked at Jesus' narrowness, the limits and boundaries he lived within. Charles Edward Jefferson writes this about Jesus. He goes, "There was a purpose in this narrowness and a reason for it. His narrowness was a product of his breadth. He walked the narrow path because he carried in his heart the dream of an empire which was vast. By standing in one place and striking repeatedly the strings of the same set of hearts, he started vibrations which have filled the world with music. By carefully tending the fire which he had kindled, he made it hot enough to change the spiritual climate of many lands. By saturating a little circle of chosen followers with his spirit, he made them capable of carrying on their shoulders the lost race to God. By persistently treading a single path, he made that path so luminous that every eye can see it by discarding false ideas. And by opposing wicked men, he has made it easier for truth seekers and the soldiers of God in each succeeding generation to fight a good fight and to win the crown. By being faithful in a few things, he won the place of lordship over many cities. And by limiting himself and by making himself of no reputation, he founded a kingdom broad as humanity, and of which there shall be no end. If you study the New Testament, you will see that this man from the beginning carried the world in his eye and the race on his heart." Like I said, we're going to talk about the breadth of Jesus. There's no way we can cover every aspect of that in Jesus' life, so we're going to just focus on 3. We're going to focus on the breadth of his vision, of his hope, and of his love. Turn to Matthew 28. In Matthew chapter 28, it says in verse 18, this is right before Jesus ascends back to heaven. It says, "Then Jesus came to them and said, 'All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. And surely I'm with you always to the very end of the age.'" Jesus confined his ministry to Palestine. There'll be passages you read where like a Syrophoenician woman comes to him and he says, no, I've only been sent to the lost sheep of Israel. But this passage makes it clear that Jesus always had a vision for the entire world. He always had it as a part of his plan that all nations would get to hear the gospel. That every corner of the globe would be reached. Now, I don't know about you, but often for me, I think I can settle for a vision of life that's just confined to myself. I envision a life where, okay, I have everything I need. My family, my loved ones, we have everything we need, and I can stay within that narrow bandwidth. But Jesus' vision was far greater than that. He wanted the whole world. He always carried in his mind and in his heart a vision for the entire planet and all people. I think this is something that we need to try to get better at. To not get so consumed with the day-to-day and just getting by day-to-day, but to keep a broader vision of what is going on and the impact that can be made, even by the smallest of actions. For those of you who are parents, you need to parent your children well, not just because that's what God wants us to do or because we love them and want what's best for them, but let's expand our vision. I mean, who are the people your children might come into contact with and affect in some way? It might be someone of importance. Your child very well could raise up to be someone of importance that touches millions of lives. So when you just being a godly, great parent, you can have a global vision for what that could become. I'm reminded of one of my good friends. He was one of my groomsmen, a childhood friend growing up. His name is Charles Yuan. He and his family are from Liberia. His father, Harry, and his mother, May, fled Liberia, landed in the United States, landed in Lynn, Massachusetts, which, if you're familiar with Lynn, Massachusetts, you're not impressed by it all that much. Or at least several decades ago, you weren't. And so anyways, there in Lynn, Massachusetts, a disciple shared his faith, and Harry and May became disciples of Jesus. Fast forward a few decades, and the Yuans are back in Liberia. Now, Harry, as a disciple back in Liberia, Liberia is rebuilding after some wars and things and conflicts that happened there. And Harry was an important man beforehand. He gets reconnected, and he actually helps the first female democratically elected leader on the continent of Africa get elected as president of Liberia, which is amazing in and of itself. But then through his influence, she starts attending some of the ICOC services in Liberia. And this worldwide impact was made because one disciple in Lynn, Massachusetts shared their faith. And it had this amazing impact on this entire country over in Africa. What can you do to gain a bigger vision for the world that is more in line with the vision Jesus had? In what ways can your vision expand? How can you contribute to Jesus' global vision? Let's try to grow and having the same kind of vision, the breadth of vision that Jesus had. Secondly, Jesus' breadth of hope. And by the breadth of his hope we mean the ability for Jesus to believe in other people, to believe in people who no one else believed in, to hope in the hopeless, for those that seemed like a lost cause. For this, we're going to read Luke chapter 19. In Luke 19 and verse 1, Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he couldn't see over the crowd. And so he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. And when he reached the spot, he looked up and said, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. And all the people saw this and began to mutter, "He's gone to be the guest of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, Here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I'll pay him back 4 times the amount. And Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. Verse 3 mentions that Zacchaeus was a short man, and that's why he couldn't make it through the crowd. I think it's also just as likely that no one in the crowd would have even let him through, would have given him that courtesy. Taxes are never popular. Not back in Jesus' day, not today. Let alone people that collect taxes. And so in that culture, the tax collectors, they would often collect more than what was needed, and they would keep the difference for themselves. This made them not popular, as you can imagine. To the average Jew, Zacchaeus was a traitor. Here's a guy who is betraying his own people. He's aligning with the Romans who are oppressing his own people, and Zacchaeus is getting wealthy from doing it. He's a lost cause. The average Jew would want nothing to do with Zacchaeus. There would be no hope for him in the eyes of most of the Jews of Jesus' time. But Jesus had hope for Zacchaeus. And that made all the difference in his life. He goes, not only will I stop cheating people out of money, but I'll pay him back. And I won't just pay him back. I'll pay back 4 times the amount. Jesus was able to have hope for those who no one else was able to have hope for. Again, I want to read from Charles Edward Jefferson. He's talking about Jesus. He goes, his hope was as immeasurable as his love. He did not reject the refuse of society. He saw promise even in the scum. The dregs of society are not to be carelessly tossed away. There's a chance for the man who is supposed to have no chance. There is hope for the man for whom men have doomed to perdition. You cannot tell what is in a man by what he says or even by what he does. There is more in him than comes out in his words and his deeds. And so Jesus proceeded to show that the so-called lost men were not lost. I want you to think of a time when someone believed in you and the difference that made in your life. I know for me, I thrive off people believing in me. I'm not one of those types where if someone says negative things to try to motivate me to prove them wrong, that I feed off that. I don't feed off that. I hate that kind of motivation, honestly. When people say, good job, we believe in you, you've got this, we got your back. I mean, those are the things that personally lift me up. But think about a time when someone believed in you and it made all the difference. And now think about Jesus, Lord of all. He believes in you. He has hope for you. You might feel like a lost cause, but to him, you're not. To him, you're worth dying for. He has all the hope and belief in you that one could ever hope for. His hope for you expands what you can even now grasp. Lastly, I want to talk about the breadth of his love, of Jesus' love. There's so much we could say about this that we're not going to have time to, but in Matthew 18, this is a great example of it. In Matthew 18, beginning in verse 21, Peter came to Jesus and asks, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? Maybe he thinks 7 times would be more than generous. But Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Oh, I'd love to have seen Peter's face when he heard that answer. The breadth of Jesus' love is so much greater than what the apostles ever bargained for. They thought, yeah, okay, 7 times. That's more than enough, right? To forgive someone. Jesus calls them to exponentially more. Once again, Charles Edward Jefferson, because whenever he, that's Jesus, spoke about love, he said something which amazed his hearers. One day, he said, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them that despitefully use you and persecute you. This is from the Sermon on the Mount. And when men stood aghast, showing their faces that only God could be expected to have a love so broad, Jesus went on to add that God is to be the model of all men who want to live right. And that one's constant aim shall be to bring his life up to God's style and to imitate him in the unbounded reach of his good will. Here's a question I want you to reflect on. Is it possible to become more loving to others? And if so, how? Can you become a more loving person? And if so, how? Here are some ways you can put this lesson into practice. Consider your response to some of these reflection questions. How can you contribute to Jesus' global vision? How can you become a more loving person if you believe that you can become a more loving person? And whatever answers you come up to those questions, do those things. Put that into practice. Pray that God leads you to someone who feels like a lost cause. Share your faith with them. Let them know that in God's eyes, they're not a lost cause. Give the gospel a chance to do something amazing in their life. I want to close with these words again from Charles Edward Jefferson. This is how he closes his chapter on the breadth of Jesus. He goes, "This then is a message for us all. No matter who you are, you have a sure place in the mind and heart of God. No matter how you have sinned, you are inside the boundaries of his sympathy." We should all say amen to that. He goes on, "No matter what you said or felt or thought or done, you are still the object of his love. No matter how often you've disappointed him, he is still expecting of you better things. Whoever you are, and wherever you are, and whatever you are included in his plans. When he laid down the lines of his vast scheme for humanity, you were not overlooked or forgotten. When he framed his church, a place inside of it was assigned to you, and that place will remain vacant until you fill it. You cannot escape him. His arms are all embracing. The width of his heart is infinite. His love is everlasting." May we thank God for the breadth of his love, of his hope, and for his vision. Amen.